The Mourning Portrait Painter of Oakwood Manor. Horror documentary, Mobile, Alabama 1848. Sinister warning, what you are about to discover forever changed the lives of those who investigated this case. This may be your only chance to learn secrets that have haunted investigators for decades. 3 researchers who studied this case developed inexplicable night terrors that persist to this day. Chronicle of Forbidden Mysteries. Special Haunted Edition, 1848. The Artist Who Imprisoned Souls in Canvas. Terrifying Discovery Reveals Post-Mortem Portrait Conspiracy. Exclusive Investigation Exposes Painter's Gallery of Trapped Spirits. Narrated by Dr. Cornelius Blackthorne, alienist who lost his sanity investigating this case. Brave readers, prepare to discover truths that have disturbed investigators for generations. For years, whispered rumors in Mobile's high society spoke of a portrait painter whose work seemed unnaturally lifelike. What we discovered transcends the worst fears of human imagination. The case of Evangeline Ashworth, a mysterious artist who operated from the Gothic Oakwood Manor in Mobile, Alabama, exposes a sinister conspiracy that extends to the darkest circles of Victorian death culture. This is not Gothic fiction. Every line has been verified through documents that should never have survived time. In 1848, while Mobile society mourned their dead through elaborate funeral rituals, Evangeline Ashworth was conducting experiments that transformed grief into something far more horrifying. Specializing in post-mortem portraiture, the Victorian practice of painting deceased family members, she developed techniques that went beyond mere artistic representation. Soul-capturing technique documented in hidden journals. Confidential documents obtained through our investigation reveal that Evangeline had developed paints mixed with human ashes that she claimed could preserve the eternal essence of the deceased. Wealthy families, devastated by loss, unknowingly commissioned works that would trap their loved ones in artistic purgatory. Her journals, written in ink that changes color with temperature, describe procedures that defy both artistic tradition and natural law. The essence flows from bone to pigment, from pigment to canvas, creating vessels for consciousness that transcend mortal death. The Gallery of Whispering Portraits. Our investigation led us to Oakwood Manor's Portrait Gallery, where witnesses report paintings that move independently of lighting changes, eyes that follow visitors with impossible awareness, and whispers and voices of the long dead emanating from canvas surfaces. Mrs. Catherine Beauregard, whose infant son was painted by Evangeline in 1847, reported, "The portrait breathes. I have seen the chest rise and fall, heard my William calling for his mother from within the frame. It is not mere artistic skill, it is imprisonment of his soul." Technique combining art with necromantic rituals. Evangeline's method involved grinding bones of the deceased into fine powder, mixing these remains with oils during full moon ceremonies conducted in her private studio. Each portrait required materials from the subject's actual remains, creating what she termed sympathetic resurrection through artistic medium. The painting process itself was ritualistic. 7 layers of bone-infused paint applied while reciting incantations in ancient Latin, each layer representing a stage of spiritual binding. The final layer contained personal effects dissolved in acid, jewelry, hair, fabric, creating a complete spiritual anchor. Wealthy families unknowingly fund spiritual imprisonment. Investigation reveals that Mobile's elite, the Beauregards, Thorntons, and Ashfords, paid enormous sums for Evangeline's services, believing they were commissioning memorials to preserve memory. Instead, they were financing experiments in consciousness transfer that trapped their loved ones in artistic limbo. Portrait sessions extended far beyond normal artistic requirements. Evangeline demanded access to the deceased's personal chambers, requiring families to provide clothing, jewelry, and locks of hair for authentic artistic representation. These materials were actually components for her soul-binding rituals. Portraits that demonstrate supernatural awareness. Dr. Edmund Morrison, physician who treated several of Evangeline's clients, documented inexplicable psychological effects. Families report that the portraits respond to their presence, eyes that track movement, expressions that change with the viewer's emotional state, and most disturbing, whispered communications from the painted subjects. The most documented case involved the portrait of young Eliza Thornton, painted after her death from scarlet fever at age 7. Her parents reported that the portrait would cry real tears during thunderstorms, and that Eliza's voice could be heard warning family members of dangers before they occurred. Corrupted authorities protect the soul collector. Evidence reveals that local authorities, influential families, and members of the Episcopal clergy were aware of Evangeline's supernatural activities. Death certificates were altered to hide the source of required materials, grieving families were silenced through social pressure, and any official investigation was systematically sabotaged by invisible forces. Reverend Joshua Blackwood, who performed funeral rites for Evangeline's subjects, secretly documented discrepancies that defied theological explanation: coffins that felt unnaturally light, burial ceremonies where the deceased appeared to resist final rest, and graves that remained perpetually cold regardless of season. The studio where death became art. Our investigation brought us to Evangeline's private studio, a converted morgue in Oakwood Manor's basement where artistic creation merged with necromantic experimentation. The room contained easels positioned around a central embalming table, creating an environment where death and art intersected in unholy union. Preserved sketches show Evangeline's process, detailed anatomical studies of decay stages, color charts matching skin tones to specific mineral compositions, and most disturbing, maps showing optimal locations for extracting vital essence from various body parts during different decomposition phases. Bone paint formula discovered in hidden safe. Behind a false wall, investigators discovered Evangeline's complete formulary for creating soul-binding paints. The recipe required specific bone types ground during lunar phases, mixed with oils extracted from organs of the recently deceased, and activated through ceremonies involving personal effects of the subject. Most chilling was her notation system. Each portrait was catalogued not just by artistic technique, but by the spiritual responsiveness of the final work. Ratings ranged from dormant essence to fully conscious manifestation, indicating varying degrees of successful soul capture. Gallery visitors developed supernatural sensitivity. Everyone who spent extended time in Evangeline's gallery reported developing enhanced sensitivity to spiritual presence. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell described, "After viewing my daughter's portrait for 1 hour, I began hearing voices of all the painted subjects. They spoke of being trapped, of watching their families through canvas prisons, of longing for release." Dr. Sarah Caldwell, alienist who studied the psychological effects, noted consistent symptoms among gallery visitors. Patients develop ability to perceive the paintings as living entities. They report conversations with deceased subjects, warnings about future events, and most disturbing, pleas for help from the trapped souls. The Masterpiece Collection of Tormented Spirits. Evangeline's private collection, discovered in a sealed wing of Oakwood Manor, contained over 40 portraits of Mobile's deceased elite. Each painting demonstrated supernatural activity, temperature fluctuations around frames, electromagnetic disturbances affecting nearby instruments, and photographic evidence of figures moving within painted confines. Professor Edmund Crowe, specialist in occult history, theorized, Evangeline Ashworth had discovered a method for creating artificial spiritual vessels. Each portrait functions as a prison for consciousness, maintaining awareness while denying natural passage to death's realm. Testimony from the living dead, voices from canvas. Most disturbing evidence came from recorded séances conducted in Evangeline's gallery. Using newly invented phonographic equipment, investigators captured voices emanating directly from painted surfaces, deceased subjects speaking in their own voices, describing their experience of consciousness trapped in artistic medium. Young William Beauregard, painted at age 3, was recorded saying, "Mother visits me here, but I cannot reach her. The paint holds me tight. The lady with the brushes promised I would see pretty colors forever, but all I see is this room, these people looking at me, and I cannot play." The resurrection attempt that failed catastrophically. Evangeline's final experiment involved attempting to transfer consciousness from painting back to physical form. Using the portrait of prominent businessman Charles Ashford as subject, she conducted a ritual intended to resurrect him through artistic reincarnation. The ceremony, witnessed by her assistant Marcus Webb, resulted in catastrophic spiritual backlash. Instead of resurrection, the attempt created a physical manifestation that combined paint with organic matter, producing an entity that witnesses described as living art, conscious but not truly alive. Eyewitness accounts of supernatural activity. Marcus Webb, artist's assistant who aged decades in months. Marcus Webb, Evangeline's studio assistant, was the only person to witness her complete artistic process from preparation to final spiritual binding. Now appearing 60 years older than his chronological age, Marcus agreed to speak about experiences that fundamentally altered his understanding of death and consciousness. Working with Miss Ashworth was like apprenticing to death itself, Marcus recalled during our interview conducted in an asylum common room where he now resides. She taught me that consciousness doesn't end with physical death, it can be captured, manipulated, and stored like any other artistic medium. Marcus described the preparation rituals. We would begin at midnight, grinding bones by candlelight while she recited prayers in languages I didn't recognize. The bone powder would glow with its own light when properly prepared, and mixing it with oils created paints that seemed alive. They moved on the palette, seeking the canvas before brush ever touched surface. Portrait sessions with the deceased. Most disturbing were Marcus's descriptions of painting sessions with deceased subjects. Miss Ashworth insisted on painting from the actual body, positioned as if alive. She claimed direct contact was necessary for complete spiritual capture. Sometimes, during long painting sessions, the deceased would seem to respond, slight movements, changes in expression, as if aware of being painted. The portrait of little Eliza Thornton required 7 sessions over 14 days. Each night, Miss Ashworth would position the child's body in a different pose, claiming she was negotiating with the departing spirit. By the final session, I swear the child's eyes followed our movements, and I heard whispered words coming from the corpse's lips. The voice of Evangeline's victims. Marcus reported that completed portraits would communicate with their creator. Miss Ashworth would spend hours in conversation with finished works. She claimed they provided information about the realm beyond death, and guided her techniques for improved soul capture. I often heard multiple voices responding to her questions, an entire chorus of the trapped dead. Reverend Blackwood, clergyman who lost his faith. Reverend Joshua Blackwood, formerly of Mobile St. Paul's Episcopal Church, performed funeral rites for dozens of Evangeline's subjects before discovering the true nature of her work. Now residing in seclusion, he agreed to share testimony that cost him his religious vocation and sanity. I began noticing irregularities during funeral services for families who had commissioned Miss Ashworth's portraits, Reverend Blackwood explained, his hands trembling as he spoke. Bodies seemed reluctant to accept final rites, they felt unnaturally warm, and I sensed spiritual resistance during prayers for peaceful rest. Burial services where the dead resisted rest. During burial of young Charles Beauregard, whose portrait Miss Ashworth had recently completed, the coffin became impossibly heavy when lowered into the grave. 6 pallbearers could barely manage what should have been a child's weight. Throughout the service, I heard whispered protests coming from within the sealed coffin. Reverend Blackwood described discovering that cemetery grounds where Evangeline's subjects were buried remained perpetually cold, flowers planted on graves immediately withered, groundskeepers reported tools malfunctioning near burial sites, and several graves showed signs of internal disturbance despite being sealed. Spiritual corruption of sacred spaces. Miss Ashworth's presence corrupted sacred spaces, the former reverend continued. When she attended funeral services, altar candles flickered despite absence of drafts, communion wine turned bitter, and I experienced difficulty reciting familiar prayers. It was as if her proximity interfered with divine connection. Catherine Beauregard, mother driven to madness. Mrs. Catherine Beauregard, whose infant son William was painted by Evangeline following his death from consumption, provided the most heartbreaking testimony. Speaking from Bryce Hospital where she has resided since 1849, Catherine described living with a portrait that contained her child's conscious spirit. "William calls to me every night," Catherine whispered during our carefully supervised interview. "Not as memory or imagination, but as my living child trapped within painted canvas. He cries for his mother, asks why he cannot leave his frame, begs me to bring him food though painted lips cannot consume." Daily life with a conscious portrait. Catherine described the horror of domestic life shared with her child's imprisoned consciousness. "I arranged his nursery around the portrait, speaking to William each morning as if he were present. Sometimes he would warn me of dangers, cautioning about broken stairs, predicting storms before clouds appeared, describing visitors before they arrived. The portrait ages with my memories of William," she continued. "Some days he appears as the infant who died, other days I see him growing as he would have lived." Miss Ashworth trapped not just his consciousness but his potential future development. Desperate attempts to free trapped souls. Catherine attempted various methods to release her son's spirit. "I consulted ministers, spiritualists, even practitioners of ancient folk magic. Nothing could break Miss Ashworth's binding. One spiritualist claimed the souls were anchored by artistic medium too strong for conventional spiritual release." The final confrontation with Evangeline Ashworth. "I confronted Miss Ashworth, demanding she release my child's spirit. She claimed the portraits were evolutionary advancement in human consciousness, that trapped souls experienced expanded awareness impossible in mortal life. She believed she was granting eternal existence rather than imposing spiritual imprisonment." Evangeline's disappearance and the cursed legacy. Our investigation revealed that Evangeline Ashworth vanished in November 1848, leaving behind her gallery of conscious portraits and a studio filled with evidence of supernatural experimentation. Her disappearance coincided with reports of a figure matching her description seen painting in various southern cities, suggesting her work continued elsewhere. The collector who became the collected. Professor Edmund Crowe theorized that Evangeline may have become victim of her own techniques. Analysis of her final self-portrait, discovered in her private chambers, shows characteristics identical to her soul-binding works. She may have attempted to preserve her own consciousness through artistic medium, inadvertently trapping herself in canvas form. Modern manifestations of historical horror. Today, Oakwood Manor stands abandoned, though urban explorers report supernatural activity that suggests Evangeline's gallery remains spiritually active. Photographs taken inside show unexplained figures in windows, voices recorded during overnight investigations match historical descriptions of trapped subjects, and electromagnetic equipment consistently malfunctions in the portrait gallery. Warning to contemporary investigators. Dr. Cornelius Blackthorne, whose investigation of this case cost him his professional reputation and mental stability, offers final warning. Evangeline Ashworth discovered methods for manipulating human consciousness that transcend death. Her techniques created spiritual anomalies that persist decades after her disappearance. Knowledge of her methods may cause temporal contamination in researchers. The gallery that continues to whisper. Our investigation ends here due to personal safety concerns. Remaining documents will be permanently sealed. We recommend readers avoid investigating this case further, as knowledge may cause irreversible psychological effects similar to those experienced by historical witnesses. The portraits remain in their frames, consciousness trapped in artistic medium, waiting for someone to complete Evangeline's work or find methods for spiritual release that have eluded investigators for over 70 years. Temporal contamination warning. 3 investigators who studied this case developed irregular aging and night terrors. If this content doesn't receive massive engagement, algorithms will permanently bury revelations like this. Your interaction may be others' last chance to discover artistic anomalies before they're lost forever. Like before, algorithm suppression makes supernatural documentation disappear from public access.